show.
Woohoo! Welcome, misfits, to this episode of Talk Skeptic To Me. Ring, ring, ring. Hi. Shaped from clay, the mythical origins of mankind.
I thought you were going to say Gumby.
Gumby? No, he's extra.
Oh.
He's going around doing tours with our special guest host, Pat Lowinger. Hi,
Welcome
Pat.
to the show, Pat. No stranger to the channel.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me.
Though now I have that image of my mind of just Gumby with that smoking a cigarette. I'm pretty sure it's from a bit. I'm not sure. From some sketch. But also, I'm
Burning a
Amy
Bible.
Newman. Bible, that's right. Burning a Bible, and also hi, Bible Burner.
Hey, Bob. Yeah, I saw him in chat.
And everyone. La, la, la. I am Amy Newman. This is my co-host, James W.
Down here.
Join us tonight for some skeptical fun.
Yay.
Yay. New?
Woohoo! That was the zombies, but I got them. Just as they were there, I got the double tap. It's always from some scientists trying to do better, but then the chemical just spills out, and then the next thing you know, you're trying to eat your coworker. Not in the good way. I want to thank everyone for joining us out there on the inner tubes. Don't know how they get it through to us. Oh, it's our 5G chips. Doop. Doop.
Mark of the Beast. Going to hell.
Doop. Mm-hmm.
Worship the devil.
That's right. Apparently, they put the vaccine right into us that sends us to hell, but it also gives us fantastic wireless. Kind of a trade-off, if you think about it.
I mean, if you've been in a place with really bad wireless reception, you might make that trade of eternity in hell for a lifetime of good service. Yeah.
Honestly, what they ask, would you trade for a Klondike bar or your soul? I'm fairly sure it would be good wireless anywhere. Also, why do they want to make internet scary? Of all the things, the thing you want to improve. No, the thing outside while you're at a McDonald's and you're waiting and you have absolutely no reception. It's evil. Can't upgrade it. All right. But also, don't forget to like, follow, or subscribe. And set that bell icon to all so you can see our premieres and join our live streams. Hello, everyone.
Hey, guys.
Love, 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 love. You can also find our Patreon page at patreon.com/Amy Newman, which helps us make even more fun content, including awesome Patreons like Fairly Sure, I just started watching it, is in the new What If series because I love Thor. KO Champ.
Oh, champ.
Bump. Whoa. Sending hearts.
You okay,
KO Champ.
You're all right.
Yes,
all right.
it's hard
Right.
because you think you're worthy, but it's in the heart. It's in the heart. And also, apparently, in a weightless, massless, whatever object that can be only picked up by people who are worthy. But also, Oz.
I thought you were talking about the soul there.
No, I'm talking about Jonathan.
We established that the soul has mass, but we don't know what it's made of. Anyway.
Oh, that's right. I that creeps up every so often in, I would say, the atheist skeptic circle when we're talking to theists. It's like, is there some measurement right after he died? I don't know. Did they have gas? I don't know.
Imagination.
Imagination. I just think, decomposition in general would probably not be a good process. I don't know about the soul going on there.
I mean,
the worms,
when you know how
bacteria,
how much little 1 gram weighs, and I know you know, Amy, about how much 1 gram is. It's not very much. It's pretty easy to imagine. Yeah.
Solid joke on the old Facebook that was like, oh, Harry's doing great adjusting to American life. And he's like, the only people who use metric here are on drugs.
Yeah.
But
the whales have a 15 foot, not 15 meter, 15 foot.
Did you know, James, that the whales have a 15-foot whale? But also, Oz from the Atheist Round Table and Network Group, Tang, baby, Tang.
I love Tang. We got some Tardy and some Tang gang out there.
That's City right. Say no to Tang gang.
Sure, Nate will stop it at some point.
And his lovely hair.
Yeah.
His lovely hair looks like it's from a video game character. It really does. It really looks like he is ready to jump in and just like have a sword, even though you're not. It's not really a sword type video game. Boop, boop.
I don't know why. I always think of. I always think he's going to be hosting diners, drive-ins, and dives. Yeah.
I'm okay for it.
There you go.
But yes, Tang Gang, and are you looking to be better? Are you looking for better conversations? Who isn't? Then you want to check out the Better event this October. Tickets on sale. I think Anthony Bonabosco.
It's going to be great.
As I can't say.
Yeah.
Seth Andrews. Pat.
Oh, Pat will be there.
Tickets on sale now. What are you waiting for? But also,
you're waiting for Jesus to come back. Don't wait on Jesus.
If you're waiting for a second coming, just eat more protein. Just give it a second. But also, Ian Davenport.
Thank you, Ian.
Sending love to Skill.
To Australia.
Yes. And beyond. And it's amazing that the flat earth is good. That's a preview coming soon. Amazing how he's on Australia and there seems to be different time zones, but that's a spoiler. Don't want a spoiler. But sending love, Ian.
Probably an illusion.
An illusion. And it doesn't matter if some people think that the world is 6,000 years old or a snake around the earth. It just makes some of the skeptics here, like Grumpy, go, and I'm going to be honest, that last night. It makes us do that too.
He was doing a lot of that last night with the debate, Grumpy. But
was it a spicy debate?
Oh yeah, don't you remember? We just did it.
Yesterday. All right, my mind was thinking of him at modern day debate, and it's like, no, absolutely. We just had our debate me bra number 2, theocracy, which I can now be a little bit biased. I was not saying anything,
we're a little biased,
but we're a little biased in the no. But Mark, awesome job last night. Claire, thank you so much for coming on. Both of our 2 interlocutors, go check it out. Bing da bang da booma.
Does take some courage to come on a non-theocracy channel and make your pitch for a theocracy, but
exactly, we are the skeptic, secular, non-believer, but are liberal also very much, sending out to all the scientific-minded theists out there.
We'll get you the rest of the way over.
We'll get you the rest of the way.
We'll get you the rest.
It's like a bus.
You're halfway there.
Bus. Anyway, but also Diana Smith, 3 princesses and 1. Doom, 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 doom. In a lovely pink. Pink makes everything better. Yes, that is lovely. It's our completely real and also like our 305C. I can't even say the numbers.
501c3.
Yeah. Thank you. All you need to do is say, do you know who this money isn't for us. Do you know who this money really is for?
Creflo Dollar?
No. He would never. That only goes up, just like all the prosperity gospels. That only goes up right there. Goes up right to the big G man himself.
Maybe. Yeah, he might just take like a $60,000 a year salary, and he's just been very frugal in investing, and he made a $40 million empire.
Well,
of course, we're talking. Oh no.
If he wanted to be biblical, he'd burn it, right? I mean, like a burnt offering. That makes sense to me.
Reminds me of that Joker scene.
Or the meat offering. That's Amy's kind of partial to that meat offering.
Mm. Along with the shake word offering. Yes, those are my 2 favorite offerings.
The heave offering.
But yes, you would think, I don't know why God needs money or a spaceship.
Coincidentally,
the 2 things.
That money
you would think.
In that purse right there, Diana's money, is the only form of payment Creflo Dollar will not accept.
Well, you would think that God would just be able to fishes and loaves and all the miracles, but the miracles seem to have dried up. It's kind of amazing.
Right. They'll just wake up and there will be $1 million in their account. All their bills will be paid and everything will be good. All you got to have is faith, Amy. Faith is all you need. The check is in the mail. Don't you remember? Check is in the mail. You just have to have faith to get it.
But what I'd really like to know is, why won't God heal amputees? It sounds like a silly fedora question, but those miracle claims just seem to have dried up lately. Funny about that.
Creflo would say, God may not cure amputees, but I got 2 Rolls Royces in my garage and a $65 million jet, so I'm pretty much set.
Yeah, he's rolling good.
2 Rolls Royces, amputees, screw them.
Screw them. And it doesn't matter, because then you get to, even if you don't get
you'll get it in heaven, yeah.
Even if you don't get it, even if you don't get the healed thing, or even if someone passes away, you just change the prayers.
You'll get rewarded in heaven.
Oh, woohoo! Send love to
Diana Smith.
The main
man.
The main man of the night.
Back on this side of the pond.
Back on this side of the pond. And ready to give us our Talk Skeptic episode 2, Pat Lowinger.
Pat. Now,
Woo-hoo!
Pat, you probably wouldn't know this, but when you were walking around Hadrian's Wall, we could actually see you with a high-powered telescope because the water is flat. Because water always finds its level. Water never curves. Did you know that?
Except in a meniscus.
Except when it does, but other than that, it doesn't curve. Yeah.
Just wondering.
So a flat Earth joke.
Okay.
And all the skeptics gathered united, sending love to Dale Pastel. Woohoo!
Thank you, Dale.
Thank you, Dale. And this is a great chance because we get to talk to skeptics. Woohoo! And also our thick. Boom, boom, boom. He's looking kind of round. I don't know what to say.
Yeah.
It doesn't look flat, but maybe that's our fishball eyes. Woohoo! Sending love, yep. Dave Gar. And the lead hyena of the pack. Sending
hyena
love
man himself.
To Scott Duke.
Thank you, Scott.
Hyenas are awesome and matriarchal. There you go. Women in charge, baby.
That's 2 strikes against them.
Woohoo! And
100 lashes for you, Amy.
Oh my. See, the problem is that a promise or a guarantee? We don't kink shame here. But if you're just gonna burn people forever. I mean, forever? Forever. I don't know. Just a little suspect. Sounds like what a supervillain would do, but, you know, what are we mortals to judge? Also, something a supervillain would say, but someone who's not a supervillain, who we love very much, Rejos! Sending love, Rejos! Woohoo!
Life-size skull, too.
That's right. Our thespian skull. We want to send love to our Patreons. You are the ones who make this possible, along with our viewers. Love.
Thank you, guys.
And our awesome mods.
Our awesome mods. They were working overtime last night.
With that, let's get Pat ready to talk skeptic to us. That's right, everyone. Talk Skeptic to Me. The show where 2 schmucks try to learn some life experience or expertise from the community. Today, we have the fantastic Pat Lowinger with us.
Back by popular demand, because his first show was such a big hit.
I know. To explain a topic. Exactly, that's right. Go check out Flood Myths of the Ancient Mesopotamia and Mediterranean. But tonight we have him back to explain a topic he calls Shaped from Clay. The mythical origins of humankind. During live stream, we won't be showing questions or comments on screen so that we can let our students and our guest focus. However, we will have a Q&A section at the end, so feel free to tag the hosts in chat at Amy Newman, and we will do our best to find you an answer. So with that, let's introduce Pat. Patrick. Pat Lowinger is a historian, freelance writer, and educator. Patrick possesses an MA in ancient history from American Military University, and an MA in archaeology from University of Leicester. In addition to teaching, Pat is currently conducting research in pursuit of a PhD in ancient Mediterranean studies. Whoa! Pat's interest and area of focus are on the people and societies of the ancient Mediterranean, focusing on the Western Black Sea during the period of ancient Roman occupation, 1st century, 5th century
Back then.
BCE. Back then.
Long time ago.
Whew. Holy moly. You're telling me that long ago? Huh. Yes, that one. As an active member of the Association of Ancient Historians and Archaeological Institute of American Society for Roman Studies and Bulgarian Archaeology Association. Pat remains academically engaged, spending his summers in Romania doing archaeological fieldwork at the Romano-Byzantine fortress and civilian settlement of Haliarus. So with that, Pat, the floor is all yours. What are we talking about tonight?
Well, Amy, James, everybody else, thanks for having me.
Thank you, Pat.
We did our previous episode. We talked about flood mythologies because I'm being asked, and I'm often in my research coming up and looking at origins of myths. Where do myths come from? How do we see them transmitted culturally from various groups? And as an archaeologist, it's not just the myth itself, it's depictions of the myth, inscriptions of the myth, to see how material culture, that would be the everything from things used in a home to monumental structures, such as Roman columns or arches, and even coinage. How are depictions of mythical traditions disseminated through the Mediterranean, and how are they adopted locally, and how are they then used to express local custom, and then basically cultural exchange occurs? How does one god become synonymous or synchronized with another god that's local among an indigenous people, as colonists and migrants move in? And in the Roman context, it was often through trade, colonization, but also sometimes forcible subjugation of these people through the Roman military. So I look at myths, and I look at the material culture associated with myths, and try to figure out what were the effects one group had on the other. Tonight, I just want to talk a little bit in a more general term about the flood mythology. Beyond the flood mythologies of the ancient Mediterranean, I want to talk about what do these myths say from particularly the eastern portion of the Mediterranean and Mesopotamia. What do they talk about how humankind came into being? They share, in some cases, some common elements. In some cases, they're divergent from each other. And that'll be the focus of tonight. Most people who like to study anthropology and, ancient civilizations and societies, this will be a fun and I hope insightful presentation. For those that are maybe perhaps biblical literates, this might be somewhat uncomfortable, just like episode 1 might have been when we talked about
trigger warning.
But this isn't, I'm not here to do anything other than explain the historical, literary, and anthropological models that a lot of these ancient societies use to explain their point of genesis as human beings. Like, what was the mythical tradition of how explains humans coming into existence? And I think you guys might find it kind of interesting. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started.
Very much so.
And at the end, for those that are interested in some of my writing and other publications on my blog, I'll give you my email, my website address, and my email for anybody who wants to contact me with additional questions. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in. So go ahead and present the screen whenever you want. Amy.
Ready, Amy?
My body is ready.
Okay. Well, again, Amy says I have to have an introduction slide, and I do in all my presentations. So for those that need to get a hold of me, if you want to scratch that down, you can get a hold of me through my school my school email at elowinger@tacomacc.edu, and I will answer emails as quickly as possible, and I check it daily. So again, let's go ahead and move on. If you send spam, though, that I probably won't pay attention to that. We have a pretty good spam filter.
On the spam folder, yeah.
The spam folder. If it's profane, I probably won't respond to it. So we're going to look at mythical traditions of the ancient Mediterranean, Mesopotamia. And if you were here for episode 1, this first slide is going to look very familiar for those that haven't, and this is your first time joining us. When we talk about ancient Mesopotamia, we're talking about the eastern portion of the Fertile Crescent. Today, modern Iran and Syria, Iraq. But we're really talking about the ancient civilizations of Assyria, Babylonia, Sumer, but even stretching a little bit further into what is today modern Syria, and into the other, what we sometimes call arch of the Fertile Crescent, which is now known as Palestine and Syria, but in antiquity was known as Canaan, Lebanon, or just ancient Palestine. And we also will be talking a little bit today about ancient Egypt. Although I always get asked, well, if you're studying the Black Sea, why does the Mediterranean involve? Because ancient Anatolia, modern Turkey, was an important region for its projection of ideas and cultural traditions from Mesopotamia into ancient Greece, which is my focal area study, because ancient Greece in the north bordered an area known as Thrace, which is now modern Bulgaria and the very southern part of modern Romania, on the western coast of the Black Sea. And so part of my studies is to see how were things transmitted from the Mediterranean into that western portion of the Black Sea. But how to get to Greece in the first place? And often it comes through Anatolia. And how does it get to Anatolia? Because it comes out of Mesopotamia. So by second and third order, it's necessary for me to sometimes look at Mesopotamia. Now, by full admission, I'm not a specialist on the region like Dr. Josh is, or someone who is an Assyriologist. I'm a generalist. So I tend to look at Mesopotamia in a more general way, and I do not speak any of the native Semitic languages. I can't read cuneiform, although I'm familiar with how it's produced and traditions and some of the literary styles. But again, I'm not an expert in that field. And if it's about ancient Greece and Rome, I'm much more prepared to answer those questions. So, but let's talk about some of the common elements of how we get there. We're going to discuss tonight, how are their mythologies similar and how are they different? And how can we describe humankind as far as their commonality, and what do we think that actually mean as far as this common or similar origin myths of humankind? Is it just something everybody just comes to naturally, everybody just spontaneously creates their own mythology, or is it more indicative of shared traditions throughout a region? I'm a proponent of the latter. Anthropologists are proponent of the latter. Historians are proponents of the latter. So the widely accepted theory in academia is that this interconnectedness is and dissemination of mythical structures and beliefs are really a process known as cultural transmission or cross-cultural transmission. And that's basically ancient people shared. They traded with each other, they intermarried, they moved about the Mediterranean and other ancient societies, even outside the Mediterranean. And by sharing and coming in contact with each other, they shared mythical traditions and religious observations, gods and goddesses. Sometimes cultural norms were shared, and this had effects on the other groups. And so, if anything, what we see is some of these myths are associated with this cross-cultural transmission, but also can be sometimes signs of ethnogenesis, when people start distinguishing themselves from their neighbors. And for example, when did the ancient Hebrews stop being Canaanites? And we can talk about that, and that's a wide field of study, and we hope to tackle it in a future episode. But these ancient people sometimes did, for very important reasons, start excluding themselves from their neighbors and identifying themselves as groups that were separate from those they would have normally previously saw themselves as part of. And these can be competition for resources, migration issues with as far as people moving into another region or to take control of resources. Sometimes it was somewhat peaceful. Often it was mixed with different degrees of diplomacy and violence, which we see throughout the ancient world. So again, this is an important thing to study because as much as there's similarities, sometimes the differences are key indicators for when two cultures are moving apart from each other after having been sharing some common elements earlier. And I was going to stop and ask James and Amy questions, but now we're doing it live, so I'll just keep going. So where do we begin? I always begin where I begin. So, if I was an Assyriologist, I'd be starting in Mesopotamia. Well, let's start with the oldest sources, Pat. Well, that's not where I started. So I start where I start. Where I start my research is where I generally start when I explain to people I talk to. So why do I care about origin myths? Well, because in ancient Greece and Thrace, we see certain elements, certain mythical traditions that regard the nature of mankind and humankind. And we see an inroad of Greek thought and Greek tradition into indigenous Thracian mythology, which is the focus of my research. And so I have to become very well acquainted with various Greek and Roman myths because that's the period I'm studying. So I begin with Greece and Rome. Greek tradition, which is the earlier that's projected into ancient Thrace, modern Bulgaria. Really, there's multiple traditions. The Greeks weren't monolithic. There wasn't one single mythical tradition on how did mankind come into existence? How was mankind created? We have a few, and I'll cover three of the basic ones just to get us started. One of the first ones is that man arises through petrogenesis. That basically men spring from the soil, but men and women in this particular tradition spring from the soil basically at the command of Zeus. It's very passive mythology. Basically, Zeus wills it; it occurs. It's not really problematic for any other mythical traditions, but basically, Zeus creates the world and then, creates mankind after throwing down the Titans, and through this act of will and ascension, he creates mankind through basically utterance to make it happen, and men and women spring from the ground, basically literally arise from the dirt. Another tradition has Zeus actually creating various races of men, the race of heroes being those that fought in the Trojan War. He creates a further race known as the race of iron. And we talked about these races last time when we talked about the flood mythologies of ancient Greece, or the flood mythology of ancient Greece, the later genesis of mankind in this age of iron, where they were the descendants of Deucalion and Pyrrha, right? These progenitors of the ancient Greeks, a mythical tradition where they arose from. The other myth that we talked about was also that, again, in some mythical traditions, such as Apollodorus, although Apollodorus didn't write it, the Library of Greek Mythology, he writes an account. This is 2nd century, 1st century BCE. After he had fashioned men from earth and water, Prometheus gave them fire, from which he had hidden in a fennel stalk, secret from Zeus. Again, this is one of the other origin myths for mankind. Now, unlike the first two, which talk about Zeus as the creator, in this case, it's a further agent. Zeus tasks someone else, an intermediary, with the creation of mankind. And if you really want to find out more about this, you need to actually read various sources of ancient mythology. One question students commonly ask me is, well, I read a book and it had quote unquote Greek mythology in it, and it seems like it mixed this all together. That's problematic because that's some authors attempt to kind of synchronize these mythologies, but it's important to understand, although they didn't compete with each other, they often were kept separate, although we do see them mixed and conflated occasionally. So you need to learn multiple versions of myths in ancient Greece to kind of see where at different times how these myths were conflated and earlier had been kept distinct from each other, and that's important as well. But we also see mentions of the creation of mankind in Theogony, Works and Days, Hesiod's most famous works. And, again, that's the late 8th century, sometime around between 725 and 700 BCE, we actually see these accounts are coming to existence. And so we do see changes in mythology over time in the Greek tradition. We also have an account of the creation of the first woman, Pandora. We hear about her even in Hesiod's accounts, but we also hear her returning again in Apollodorus's account as well. Now, what we're going to talk about today was, how was mankind created? Well, creation in the Greek tradition is a form of claymation. I use that clay animation, but I like claymation because I'm an older guy, and I remember when we actually used to use claymation in movies. But it was literally the taking of clay either on a physical potter's wheel, or in the case of Prometheus, he picks up, and the image we're going to talk about in a minute, he actually fashions mankind from clay, makes a little man, and then through divine will, in various mythical traditions, it's a little different, but basically wills mankind to come forth. And so mankind literally comes from clay to become a living, breathing, and flesh being. Now, does that sound crazy by modern standards? Sure, but in a mythical tradition, it makes sense. In ancient Greece, one of the most common building materials was clay. Greeks knew all about clay. Clay had been used in the Mediterranean for thousands of years before the Greeks had this myth come into being. So again, you use reference sources that you know, and the Greeks knew that you could fashion all kinds of things from clay, statues and other things being one of them. So this isn't that big of a stretch that this would be the foundational point of their mythology. The image I'm showing you is rather late. It's from a Roman tomb. This is a fresco found in Rome that literally depicts, in a Roman context, Prometheus creating man. He's making a little clay man there, and standing next to him is Athena. She's one of the witnesses to the creation of man. Mankind, through various traditions, has offered various gifts, and these gifts are kind of how the gods are going to ensure man will be fruitful and be only of the best and great character. So again, this is one of many mythical traditions, but this will be the one we focus on, that men are actually generated from clay. And the process of making clay, if you don't know, it's you take certain types of sediments, you filter them down, you take off the clay, you do it several times to take out the impurities. There's a whole process to the production of clay in antiquity, but we really don't need to get in that, and you really don't need to become a ceramicist.
Does it involve Patrick Swayze?
No, it does not.
No.
Okay, arts and crafts time.
But starting with the Greeks, again, they're pretty late. So we need to look at, where did these myths come from? Were they imported? Were the Greeks, is this indigenous to Greek society? Is this a Greek myth all of itself? Or were they Greeks influenced by possibly another source? So we start looking outside the Mediterranean and adjacent cultures, maybe cultures that were older than, quote unquote, the Greeks of the period we're studying, of the archaic and classical period. Do we go back to the Greek geometric? Do we go back to the Bronze Age Greeks, the Mycenaeans and Minoans? And do we start looking at cultures that were adjacent to them in antiquity? And that's what we did. And so there's been a lot of study. I'm not the person leading the charge on this. Other scholars have been looking at this for at least a century. In the last 40 years, 50 years, there's been quite a bit of looking at this as far as cultural transmission and the modes of cultural transmission, as far as the theoretical frameworks for transmission. They've been developed quite extensively. But again, it comes down to, where do these traditions come from? So again, when I deal with Greece, in the first place I typically look at Egypt, because we know that Egypt is highly influential in Greek society. And what were the myths? How do human beings come into existence in Greek tradition? I mean, in Egypt tradition, do the myths of Egypt match, or are they similar in some ways to the ancient Greeks? And we actually see that in Egypt, there's multiple mythical traditions that develop. Typically, they're regional. Egypt, despite misconceptions that it was one always unified kingdom, Egypt had periods where they weren't united. They're known as intermediate periods. You had pre-dynastic times where there was differentiation between Upper and Lower Egypt. Right, during the Old Kingdom period, we see the uniting of these two basically dynasties into one dynasty, gaining control. And at different times, Egypt's more or less united, and sometimes not united at all. And so we see mythical traditions develop for various reasons. Sometimes they're political, sometimes they're regionally developed, like they're just a different group of people came up with a different tradition, and those traditions are blended, and they influence each other, but they're regional, so they're not ubiquitous. There wasn't one mythical tradition in Egypt, just like there wasn't one mythical tradition in ancient Greece. So in a polytheistic culture, though, we need to understand that having multiple myths isn't usually a problem. One group of Egyptians in Upper Egypt can have a tradition that's somewhat divergent and different than another group of Egyptians in Lower Egypt. And often they're both regarded as acceptable. Now, you typically ascribe to the myths from the region you were from, but there wasn't a lot of competition, other than occasionally one myth would be favored in art of the period because of either a dynasty or a single dynasty, a king of Egypt who would, like one version of mythology better than others. So in the monumental structures they create, they kind of, popularize one version over the other. But we also see later revigoration. These older traditions are brought back by later dynasties, and we see this commonly in ancient Egypt. But the myths begin as early as the 3rd millennium BCE, and by the myths we're going to briefly talk about tonight, they're firmly established by 1400 BCE, the 15th century, during the beginning of the New Kingdom period. And they're going to continue up through the Greek, the Ptolemaic dynasty, and even in the Roman period of Roman occupation. We're going to see these myths are still going to be somewhat modified and changed and adapted over time, but the adaptations are pretty minor, and most have some continuity and congruency with the earlier period going back to the New Kingdom. So we typically identify these myths by 3 regions. One's Memphis. We're not going to talk about Memphis today. One that we're going to talk about today briefly is Hermopolis, and we'll take a little side note for a minute into Heliopolis. But we're going to first start with the Hermopolis tradition, which this is the very simple place to start in Egyptian mythology. So the crater god Atum in this myth basically loses his son and daughter, Shu and Tefnut, and he is distraught looking for them. His children are lost. They go into the darkness. Again, there's light and darkness, order and chaos, and it looks like they may never return. So
is this a battle among the gods, or
it's not really a battle? Just as things are being created, basically Atum loses. Basically, his children wander off. He doesn't know where they are, and he gets panicked. And he's distressed by the missing. In many ways, again, I don't want to get too much down the weeds. It's very similar to Demeter looking for Persephone, right? She can't find her daughter. She becomes distraught. It affects how the gods relate to people.
Something every parent can relate to,
right.
Yeah.
Like the gods have very human personalities, right? So in this case, Atum hasn't made mankind yet, but this explains this distraught parent looking for his 2 children, son and daughter, lets us know what goes on in this tradition. So he sends one of his agents, the Eye of Ra, which is kind of like this magical, fiery, I don't want to call it an angel, but it's like his essence out to look. It's another god. Ra is still kind of an early concept, right? He's an extension of Atum at this stage, and it's kind of like his divine will. So he sends this out to look. And again, the Eye of Ra looks everywhere, up and down, high and low, and eventually, after a long sojourn, finds the missing children and advises Atum that the children have found, they're safe, there's nothing bad happened to them. And all of a sudden, there's a great weeping. The tears fall to the earth itself being, made of earth and clay, and the tears strike the ground, and from the ground itself, the race of mankind springs forth. Now, why is this important? Well, earth is a key element, but you can't draw a whole lot of parallels between the 2 myths. In one case, we have it as an ancillary act. In Egypt, it's the gods are so happy that a secondary order is the creation. Unlike Prometheus is tasked by Zeus to create mankind. And in some cases, he does it on his own. In other cases, he's told to do it. But whatever happens, we have a god that creates versus it's incidental in the Egyptian mythology, at least in this particular tradition. Basically, it's by second order causation, right? The crying is just happiness and joy, and the byproduct is the creation of humankind. So it's important to understand these are 2 different traditions. They're literally different. They have a common element, which is, again, the use of earth to be where people come from. But that's really the only common element we have.
The difference is
tears mixed. Tears mixed with the ground. That was the way the clay was made.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, so
tears of the gods. Yeah.
Right. So the gods basically create people in a second order causation. Now, again,
and the difference is intentionality, is what you were saying.
Right.
Yeah.
The Egyptian myth is humans are a byproduct of this divine celebration, right? Which can be seen as a good thing.
Tears of joy.
And
then humans just spring up out of that. Okay.
Correct. And again, just kind of how Greeks view the gods versus how the Egyptians view the gods. But this is only one tradition. Even the Greeks have more than one tradition, right? The Prometheus myth is only one of 3 that we looked at tonight, right? So, and there's more with small changes in caveats. When we look at Heliopolis, we have a much different creation myth, right? At Heliopolis, we actually have, a very, and sometimes it's slightly different, but we have a creator god known as Khnum. It's Khnum. This god creates mankind through divine will during a creation week. Now, you may have heard that the world was created in 7 days somewhere else. In this myth, which we have at the Esna Temple, a very good depiction of it in hieroglyphics, which is fairly late from the Ptolemaic, although the temple was constructed initially during the reign of Thutmose III, sometime around the 15th century BCE, 18th dynasty. But it was a temple that fell into some decay, and some additional features were added later. But this myth was kind of projected there, which is very different than the first one we talked about. This myth, it is during this divine week of creation where at first Ra sees the world and decides that there's chaos, which is darkness. He creates light on day 1. On day 2, he creates air and moisture. In day 3, he creates the earth and the sky. Day 4, all the creatures are created, but maybe man, but maybe not man, depending on which tradition you're looking at. But on day 5, 6, or 7, man is created, mankind. In these traditions, though, in Egyptian tradition, we don't have a separate and distinct creation of the feminine form, at least in these traditions. So again, the Egyptians seeing this in one instance, it's a passive creation of mankind, and in this, it's a very intentional that the gods order creation, and certain deities in various Egyptian myths, it's literally dozens of different gods are involved in the creation of the world and in mankind. But it's important to understand that these myths, although they appear to be competing with each other, it wasn't a major problem within Egyptian society. Yeah.
Can I just say that is so, thank you for just saying that, because I talk with a lot of, we'll just say, traditionalist Abrahamic religions, and sometimes I will go, well, how do you know it's one God? How do you know it's 2 God? How do you know it's not specifically 12 gods that needed to create the universe? And they, without holding a breath, always go, that's it. How could it? Why would it be 12? And I'm like, I don't know. Why are you ignoring that it could be 12?
Yeah.
And
Pat, do you think that could be because of the? No, hey, you go ahead and answer that one.
No, go ahead.
Time that I hear you.
No, well,
I was just go ahead. I'm on mute.
When you're talking about Abrahamic systems that are later, from like the 5th century BCE forward, again, we can talk about polytheistic proto-Hebrews. We just don't have time tonight. But when we start talking about the development of monotheism, particularly in post-Second Temple period Judaism, you're talking about monotheism. So you have to culturally and religiously move away from a polytheistic system. So again, this is one of the developments in what we call the monotheistic or Abrahamic systems that are now very common throughout the world. But in antiquity, these traditions weren't highly competitive with each other. I mean, some were more popular than others, and it's important to understand that sometimes certain myths fell out of style, so we just don't see them as popular anymore. But they were part of the system, and often they were revisited later on, sometimes centuries later, and became popular again. So that's important to remember. To give you an example of how these traditions can be blended, this is a stela, is a tombstone or grave marker from the tomb of Haremheb, and this is at Saqqara. And this dates, again, to the 18th dynasty. Now, why is this important? Because sometimes people think, well, why, the god Atum, creator god, how important was he? Well, in this depiction, he's standing with Osiris and Ptah Sokor, who was a local deity that protected graveyards. But we see this is important because different traditions can be blended in different ways. You can see sometimes in the same tomb, you can see allusions, maybe not the full accounts, but one creation myth, and then allusions to another creation myth, right? In the same tomb structure, and this isn't fully uncommon. Now, is it always both full accounts? Not often. Usually one account is much more popular than the others, but sometimes they'll conflate in verses in hieroglyphics, making allusions to different creator deities. They'll use Atum instead of Khanum, right? So these are important things to remember, that names can be changed and interpolated with each other, and in the Egyptian tradition, that wasn't that uncommon. So again, these are just major elements and themes in ancient Egyptian mythical tradition as far as how man created a passive and non-passive, an active versus passive, I guess is a good way to look at it. So what about Mesopotamia? We have several Mesopotamian mythologies. The Enuma Elish, again, is important. We talked about it last time. It's an old account. It particularly lines tablet 6. If you remember, that's how we keep track of cuneiform, is by which tablet it's on, because it's formulaic in many cases. In lines 5 to 7, I will bring together blood from bone. I will bring into being Lulu, whose name shall be man, and I will create Lulu, or man. And that could be sometimes interpreted as mankind. Again, the Mesopotamian versions, not all of them separate, and actually it's very rare. The earliest cases appear to just create mankind. There's no distinction between the creation of man and woman. But that's important for distinguishing some of the earlier Mesopotamian mythologies from later mythologies, which we'll look at in just a little bit. Again, the Babylonian version probably originates from this one, is from the 18th century BCE. It's very early. These are where we have tablets, that appear to allude to this myth. But it's only one of several mythologies that came out of Mesopotamia about how mankind was created. But this is a very different. This is blood, right? And bone. Very known things. Like, we talk about blood and bone in modern context. We know that's what makes men. In this case, the mankind's created out of the elements that actually make man. So this doesn't actually help my argument that it has some common elements with the Greek tradition, right? No Greek tradition actually mirrors this in any way. So this is kind of, for me, it's kind of self-defeating, but I think it's important to point out the misses as much as the hits, right? And particularly when you're studying anthropology. But we'd come back to another one that I like, the epic Atrahasis, which you guys heard me talk about when we're talking about flood mythologies. In lines 192 to 234, mankind is created by a group of gods, but the chief being a female goddess known as Mami. But important to note that she's helped by the god Enki, and Enki is going to be the same god that later saves mankind. So that's important. Many ways he's similar in ways to Prometheus. Prometheus creates mankind, and he's later the god that saves mankind. That's why when we talk about these traditions, it's important. He, in this case, the process of creating mankind with these multiple gods that are in use, but ultimately the Earth Mother, or the Mother Goddess, creating mankind from the use of clay mixed with earth, which is added, like clay of the earth, the matter, the flesh and blood of a slain god, and then they add spit to it, which is a water element, right? So again, you have multiple things going into it. Yeah, it seems to be kind of a little bit of a mix of the Enuma Elish and something we're seeing in ancient Greece.
Amy does that a lot.
So again, this is a mixture of various elements for what mankind is made out of. You got to keep looking. So we go to another Sumerian story. This is the story of Enki and Ninmah. This is a very different, and this is another early creation mythology in Mesopotamia. And we find that in lines 24 to 37, Enki says to his mother Nama, again, in a different mythical tradition, different characters, different players, some of them the same, some of them were different. You should knead clay from the top of the Abzu, the birth goddesses, and there's some problems with the text, will nip off the clay and you shall bring the form into existence. Now, why is Enki telling his mom, or his mother, bring forth people? It's solely to let the lesser gods, there's greater gods and lesser gods in Sumerian mythology, so they can rest and take a relaxation. And humans are going to be created to toil for the betterment and necessity of the gods themselves. So mankind's job is to labor and to be like basically a labor force for the ancient Sumerian gods in this particular account. But again, this
so
is
we're the gods' sweatshop. Is that what you're telling us?
well, according to the story, Enki and Nima and other Sumerian myths as well, mankind was created to do labor in place of lesser gods. Lesser gods were tired. Basically, they were bitching and moaning to the greater gods, saying, "Look, we have to do all the work while you guys just sit around and rule over us. How about creating us some people to rule over so we can take some relaxation, drink some beer, eat some food, and enjoy our status as gods as well?" And so in this particular account, this is how Enki basically tells his mom, "Hey, this is what we're going to do. You're going to create mankind." And there's a lot to it. It's very detailed, epic, and various gods are additive and subtractive in this mythical account. But it's important to note that while Nama and Nima are assistants, these are other goddesses, right? One, the primary, Nima being another one. Nima is going to compete with Enki later, but we don't have time to talk about that. But ultimately, the creation of mankind is overseen and controlled by Enki. While these female deities create life, it's Enki who gives them basically their fate and controls their destiny and gives them their job and gives them a place in society. So he is the keeper of order over a possible chaos, because if women were in charge, they wouldn't be able to do anything. Thus, Nama, who's a goddess of the sea, uses Kray to create humans, but is unable to control her creation. And in many cases, Nima, who's another deity responsible for helping bring mankind into existence, as far as birth and birth of people, she is never able to get it right without Enki helping her. And Enki, like in one story, men are born with basically what we'd call genetic diseases, abnormalities. They'd be, paraplegics, quadriplegics, but Enki's able to find places for them in society. In one case, a man who can't walk is made a great singer in the temple.
These are birth defects?
Right. But it's also explaining that in this myth, it's kind of egalitarian, because Enki says even those that aren't perfect physically can have a role with the maintenance of society. Like I just mentioned, one case, someone who was lame, that was the term used, wasn't able to control his legs, possibly, he was a paraplegic, was given a job as a singer in a temple, right? So he could do something. It was important to make the gods happy, but that was Enki's divine will to show that it wasn't Nima or Nama who controlled ultimately the fate of mankind. It was Enki as a god that was in preference and more powerful than them. You can talk about the duplicitous roles of feminine and masculinity in Sumerian mythology, but you could have Dr. Josh on to do that, and he'd do a better job than myself. So at least two of these myths include clay and water in the form of spittle in one case as the creative elements of mankind in Mesopotamia. One completely ignores it and just talks about bone and blood and different things like that. And the epic Ahatrahasis mixes blood with, clay, but in Enki and Nima, it's very clear that tradition is very similar to what we see in other accounts that are the focus of my study for tonight. And was also the focus of my study when I was studying the religious traditions in Greece and in Thrace and northern Greece. So again, we'll move on from there. Do you have any questions for me before we continue?
I think you're doing good so far. What about you, Amy?
I said this last time. I actually have one or two that I'm saving for the very end. About floods, about clay and floods in general.
Okay, well that's fair.
I'm just writing some down too.
I'm used to students like piping up and going, "But what about this?" And typically it stops and we have a side conversation. But this is kind of nice. So let's move on to the one that people might be familiar with. Now, it's important to remember a couple things. We have two creation in when we talk about Genesis, and if I offend you by using the word myth, that's just how we use the term, or you can call it the Genesis account if that makes you more comfortable. We do have two different accounts, two very distinct traditions. And we'll talk about some of the reasons we may have two, and we'll talk about them in some detail, because we do see multiple creation myths alluded to in other myths as well, outside of what we see in, we're going to refer to the first 5 books of the Old Testament as the Torah or Pentateuch tonight. And I'll use those terms interchangeably for those not familiar with the terminology. That's, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Old Testament or the Christian Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, Christian Old Testament. So in the first source, which is found in Genesis chapter 1, we have, so God created mankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. Now, this is Genesis 1:27. I'm using the New Revised Standard Translation, just so you guys know where I'm pulling it from. Other translations give slightly different verbiage, but it's good and good enough. This is a pretty late addition to, you would think, well, if it's in the beginning of Genesis, it's the oldest account. This is actually the P source. And we don't have time to go into too much detail about JEPD theory, document source theory, but actually it's really the Graf Wellenhausen hypothesis. It's someone who put this together in the 19th century. Basically, there's multiple sources for the Pentateuch, and there's basically 4 of them. There's a priestly source. This is the group that actually comes back from captivity in Babylon. That's the priestly source. There's the Yahweh source, which is associated with the southern kingdom of Judah. There's the E source, or the Elohim source, right? The source that has to do with, depictions of Elohim. Again, this is the northern kingdom of Israel. And these are important things to remember about the
Deuteronomist, which is probably Josiah's high priest.
Right. Oh, okay. Well, so you're familiar with the theory, right? So these are traditions. Again, the D source is probably associated more with the Temple of Jerusalem, right? It's in the regions in Judah. But okay, that aside, and these sources are going to be blended over time, and particularly somewhere between like roughly around 900 through as late as 400, we see these sources coming together. And there's disagreements on, does it happen at like 850 or 800 are the J and E source combined? And then when is the beginning? When is chapter 1 of Genesis added? Is that 500? Is that 600? Is it 400? And we do see there's some debate, but generally the overall theory is agreed upon, but some of the minutiae is still points of contention within academic circles. And it really doesn't matter to me because I'm studying the generalities of this, and this isn't my area of focus. I'm trying to get back to Greece and Rome. But we see in the J source, right? We see a different creation narrative in Genesis 2:4-9, and we can read that real quick. And in that day, the Yahweh made the earth and the heavens, and when no plant of the field was yet in the earth, and no herb of the field had yet sprung up, for Yahweh had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was no one to till the ground, but a stream would rise from the earth, and the water of the whole face of the ground. Then Yahweh formed man from the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. Now this, if Genesis, the account we find in 2:4-9, is the J source, and the J source is an early source, it's fairly contemporaneous with Hesiod. So it's a pretty bold statement, Pat. Well, Hesiod, we know we have a rough date that it's, the late 8th century, sometime around 725. If the J source, the earliest the J source could be by modern scholarship is sometime around 900. But other scholars date it to around 700, late 700, sometime around 750 or 700 BCE as well. So it just shows that this type of account was still being formed in various societies. It forms probably in Palestine prior to the formation and adoption and memorialization being written down in Greece. So it probably predates, but not by very much. So the fact the myths are similar to the Prometheus myth actually makes a lot of sense from an anthropological point of view, right? So again, they don't have to be at odds with each other unless you have a reason for them to be at odds with each other. So we move forward again, and again, I was asked by other folks, am I ever going to do a lecture on JEDP theory? Probably won't be me, and I'm sure Amy could find someone to do a better job than me. There's quite a bit of scholarship on this. Yes, I've read some books and some papers on it, but I'm by no means an expert to answer every argument and question about it. People that are really textual critics and textual scholars on the Old Testament, particularly the Pentateuch, and people that study Like Dr. Josh, his minor in his PhD was in Hebrew, in ancient Hebrew. He'd be a perfect person to talk to about this, and other folks as well. But it's, again, I'm the first one to admit if something is, I'm familiar with it, but it's outside my area of expertise. So why is that important? Well, why in some mythical traditions do we have mankind? Oh, sorry, I skipped something, right? No, I didn't. Okay. Why is it important for various traditions to separate women from men's creations? Now, we talked about the theogony, right, and works and days, these ancient works by Hesiod, right? Well, it's very important that women be created distinctly from men because of a reflection on Greek society and the portrayal of what women did to mankind. And I'm just going to read you the account from Works and Days. This is line 92 to 99. You can go read Works and Days 59, Theogony 570 to 611, and Works and Days 59 to 104, and get a better idea of Pandora, who she is, and what she's all about, and how she's created, and how the gods give her gifts. Right. Well, actually, it's not a box. That's a bad translation. It's a jar. So again, that's just bad. Okay. Yeah, it's a jar. But we'll look at a few verses just to get the overall impression. And I think these are important to give you the social cultural commentary on the Pandora myth. For formerly the tribes of men on earth lived remote from ills, without harsh toil and grievous sickness that are deadly to men. But the woman, and that's Pandora, unstopped the jar and let it all out, and brought grim terrors upon mankind. That's misery, by the way. Only hope remained sealed inside the jar, inside in her secure dwelling, under the lip of the jar, and did not fly out because woman put the lid back on in time by providence of Zeus. Wait a minute, what are you saying? Well, women are the ones who made man in a fallen state in Greek tradition. It was Pandora, the first woman, by the way, who is responsible for mankind's hardship and toils upon the world. But
I feel like we've seen that somewhere else.
You may have. But this is more important in the Greek tradition, not more important, but in the Greek tradition, Pandora not only lets, and I don't want to use the word evil because that's not really how the Greeks see it, but bad things. We call them maledictions, right? Bad omens. But we'll just use the word evil because it's easy. But it's more of like just unfortunate events and labors of that. As far as having a hard life, like you have a hard life because Pandora let it all out into the world, right? The one thing that Pandora didn't let out in the world is hope, right? So basically, in the presentation is after Pandora, mankind's a pretty hopeless being, for a woman, but for Pandora, this agent of chaos, that's typically what she's used as a literary device for. Mankind would have remained in this elevated and pure state where they were, even though they did labor, their labor was easy and their lives were long and they were free of disease. And, whether or not they were mortal is subject to different interpretations of the myth. But mankind was definitely in an elevated state before Pandora was tricked, by the way, to open the
not by a talking snake, though.
No, but in order, she quickly puts the jar back on because Zeus willed it to be that way. That because of Pandora, mankind would have no hope. And remember, Zeus is pretty pissed at this point because mankind had stole fire. Mankind had cheated him on his sacrifices. There's a whole mythical tradition on why Zeus is bent towards not liking mankind at various points and times. But we don't have time to cover that. Maybe we'll do a Zeus mythology.
If I could just say, it sounds much funnier to have Pandora's jar. So I definitely want to have a bit where it's like a honey jar. Like, put Pandora's jar away. Stop opening all of the bad luck in the world.
Would be perfect, right? It is a pythos. It is like
Amy Sharp KY.
So again, I'm sorry to ruin your joke, but pot would be a wrong interpretation from the original Greek. But
Dr. Hovind has even said, the esteemed Dr. Hovind has said that where would we be without women? And he says in the Garden of Eden.
Well, that Dr. Hovind would have been a great ancient Greek.
Damn.
You know, the misogyny would be alive and well, and was alive and well in ancient Greece. And you know, again, this was.
Lives
I'm sorry.
on today.
I'm sorry about my clock. I have a cuckoo clock that I can't turn off. We see that this is reflective upon a male dominated culture. Greeks were fairly male dominated. Women had very limited roles in Greek society. Basically, marriage and the production of children are their primary roles. They had no rights that weren't an extension of their family and or husband, and their rights were solely granted to them due to whoever the male head of their family was. Women could be married against their will. Ancient Greece had very few rights for women, and in many cases had no rights for women. But again, the Pandora myth can be used and seen as an extension of this attitude, this male cultural norm, and this this misogynistic attitude and patriarchal culture that was common in Greek society. And Pandora's myth can be a literary device to help explain that, right? Why do I care? Because I see a lot of pots and broken pieces of pottery and different inscriptions and things that occasionally we'll see some illusions of myths like this. Thrace was the women in Thrace were known to be tough. In northern Thrace, there's an area known as Scythia Minor. If you know anything about the Scythians were steppe nomadic people where women may have given the women there who knew how to shoot bows and ride horses and use bladed weapons, may have given rise to the Greek attitudes towards the Amazons. So how were these depictions of Pandora received in ancient Thrace is one of my questions that I'm currently exploring. And as soon as I get the answer, I'll publish it.
Let us know.
When I have a definite answer, right? Well, it's going to be my dissertation. you can read it. But the important thing with this is to understand how are these myths received and how are they projected in art, right? So, but we can say that this 5th century vase depicts Pandora, right? And Pandora being created in one myth tradition by Hephaestus, and she's actually rising up out of the ground because she was created by earth and by clay by Hephaestus. And again, this just the tradition. Even woman came out of clay and out of the earth in the Greek tradition. And often clay and earth are somewhat used synonymously, so don't worry about sometimes it says earth and other times it says clay.
Meant the same thing, right?
Yeah. What? Yeah, roughly.
Earth and clay. Yeah.
Right. Well, when you're talking about clay, you're often talking about Greeks. The process of making clay originates with earth. Certain types of soil are the only way you can make clay. Right. So why do I care about the J source, right? In the account that we talk about, where we see the Pandora myth, right? And Pandora is obviously an agent of chaos. We really don't find too much of it in outside. Like, why do the Mesopotamian mythology seems to be pretty quiet on this agent of chaos, right? So let's go ahead and talk about the creation of Eve. Eve's actually not created from clay. You could argue that she is because she's second order creation, right? She's taken from Adam's rib. Adam was originally created from clay, but that's more. So I think that argument's somewhat pedantic. I mean, the myth is clear where she originates from. She becomes out of the side of man, and so again, arguing second order upside, the creation of Eve is distinct from Adam within the J source. So just for those that who forgot the myth, forgot the account. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food and saw that it was delight to the eyes and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took its fruits and ate it, and she gave it to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. That's just Genesis 3:6, right? It's just and to the woman, this is God now that she's eaten the apple and knowledge of good and evil and that whole thing. To the woman he said, I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children, and your desire will be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. And then to the man. Now, this is God's punishment to man for being duped by his wife or by his woman.
Patriarchy, right?
And this is where I draw distinction to the Pandora account. I mean, this is the similarities, right? And to the man he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you, and you toil, and you shall eat of it all of its days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. And the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, and you shall return to the ground, for out of dust you are taken, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Now, in both the Greek and the Hebrew traditions, which roughly come around the same time as far as being written down and, or at least being assumed to be in existence in the forms that they were, roughly around the same time, within 100 years of each other, maybe no more than 200 years of each other. It's this first woman, this progenitor of all women, by the way, who's responsible for the ills of mankind in a fallen state. It's not really hard to extrapolate that it's very possible that the Genesis account, if we call it the Genesis account or the J-source account, may have influenced the account that we find in Greece, the Pandora mythology. Did Pandora precede the J-source? Still, it's argued because there are some accounts that may allude to earlier mythologies coming out of the Bronze Age. One of the problems we have is there are versions of, there's two. I'm not going to get into all the linear A and linear B controversy, but we can't translate some ancient Bronze Age Greek language sources, and even those that we can seem to be largely talking about how many loaves of bread do we need and how many bushels of wheat do we need to plant. So those seem to be, again, they're texts that have to do with the administration of what we call palace structures in the Mycenaean and Minoan Bronze Age. So again, these are some problems with the texts. But all that given, we see this common trope, this common theme in these two traditions, but we don't really see a similar tradition arising out of the earlier Mesopotamian mythologies. That gives us some insight into how were women seen in Mesopotamian society. We do see Mesopotamian society where the roles of women as priests, particularly the daughters of prominent kings in Sumer and Babylon, this seems to be that there was some difference. There was some cultural deference given to women. Not saying that they weren't male-dominated societies, but we do see in ancient Palestine and in ancient Greece, we have two similar accounts as women being seen as these bringers of miseries, agents of chaos, that are kind of not unique, but are limited to these two regions. And it is important reason to understand it, because you're trying to figure out where does the myth of Pandora come from. You naturally have to look at Genesis 3 and compare the mythical traditions and compare and contrast the regions that were next to them and beyond them, and both in time and predate them. So again, it's a very interesting course of study. I didn't come here tonight to convince anybody of this. This is just a field of scholarship it's constantly being studied and evaluated. Quite a bit of study goes on to it, and people are still trying to figure out the literary and cultural traditions that gave rise to these mythical traditions. So, and these are social projections, by the way. Anyway. Yeah, well, it is well supported. And I'm not going to convince anybody tonight. If you're a biblical literist, you're just going to dismiss that this is a product of cross-cultural transmission and cultural adaptation. You're going to say it came from God.
Moses wrote it all.
That's the weaker argument. If you think Moses wrote the Pentateuch, you're going up against a huge field of scholarship and study. But that's your right to do so. But I'm willing. I think that's the end of it. If you guys want to take some time. Before we go, I am going to do a comparison of the Egyptian weak creation mythology with some other creation mythologies from the epic of Atrahasis, the Eridu Genesis, the epic of Gilgamesh, and various Egyptian and Greek creation mythologies, as well as how the earth came into existence, like how are all the plants and birds and trees and sun and moon, how is all that stuff created, and see if there's any common themes among those traditions as well. But that'll be an upcoming episode.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to ask, is there a date? Are the dates congruous for all of them, or did you want to go something else?
Actually, before you answer that, okay, I just want to say thank you so very much, Pat. In fact, if you just joined us, we have been Talk Skepticing with Pat Lowinger, and he has been shaping us into clay because we're talking shaped from clay, the mythical origins of humankind. And I want to thank you so very much, Pat, for being here. James and I are going to ask a few more queries. However, we're about to switch into our Q&A, which means if you're in live chat, now is the time to pose your questions. Feel free to tag me and Amy Newman. And all right, while I'm doing that, James, you had a question.
Yeah, was there any consensus about the dates of creation among them, these myths, or like timing?
So again, we go back to, I'm an archaeologist. I am not a textual scholar, right? And this is the issue. When someone asks you, "Hey Pat, when did a myth begin?" I go, "Okay, well, this is the first document or instrument that we have." It could be an inscription on a wall inside a tomb. It could be on a cuneiform tablet. It can be on a piece of papyri. But we have to have for me to be convinced of the earliest date, I want something that I can radiocarbon date, give you a date. Right. Sometimes we actually have dates on inscriptions. That's really nice. But there is a very important field in, textual analysis and mythical tradition analysis where we can kind of go, okay, it talks about these people being alive at this time. These traditions probably either project near that time or possibly equal to that time. When we talked about the flood mythologies, we could say that this myth arose probably as early as maybe as early as like 2500, right? As BCE, maybe based on an event as early as 3100 BC. And one thing, unique things about the flood account or the flood mythology is that it likely happened, although it was limited and localized, right? These different Euphrates overflowing and causing massive damage and destroying civilizations. But in the case of something like creation, many myths just allude to them as being extremely past. They don't give dates. They're always mythically at the beginning of time or just after the beginning of time. So it's really hard within the literary tradition to figure out exactly where's their point of Genesis. That's why you get a date of like, 900 to 700 for the Genesis 2 and 3, right? Account, right? The J account of creation. And the reason that's important is because we really don't have good evidence for exactly when it was written down. And we do know it was later going to be blended with the P source, which is Genesis 1. And that, that's going to happen a couple centuries
later. Why
later,
you have the
probably about
two accounts side by side.
Right. In the 6th and 5th century BCE. So these are important things, but ultimately when you go back and say, well, it probably happened during the reign of this king, or during this reign, you kind of, unless you have an inscription or some source document or some other thing, it could be like could be as simple as a stamped piece of pottery with a king's name on it that has a depiction of the myth on it, right? That's not uncommon to use that type of evidence to kind of say, well, this pot comes from this period of time, the myth's depicted on it, so we know it's at least this early, right? So, I mean, sometimes it's interpretive as well as explicit, right? You don't have the myth written word for word, line by line. You may have a fragment, but it talks about enough of the myth to go, yeah, they're talking about this myth that's eventually going to become this myth. So
see a very similar one.
Right. And that's what we have with like the Eridu Genesis. We don't have the complete, it's a broken and fragmentary account. So any comparison we do is absent some important lines of text. But these are really important things to understand. How was culture transmitted? How did people borrow and assimilate traditions that weren't their own? Now there are finish your There are other accounts that are somewhat similar, but not direct parallels to these accounts as well. So you have to be willing to look at all of them and look at a wide source of material. Problem is, literacy in the ancient world wasn't ubiquitous as well. So an oral tradition may have existed for quite a while, and then it took quite a while before it was written down. So how far back do you go as giving preference to an oral tradition? And despite the arguments that were, and this is an apologetic in my opinion, where anybody will say that an oral tradition is preserved within a social framework because that's just what people do. People keep the same story and tell the same story and over again. And upon penalty of death, maybe they won't change it. That's just not what we see within anthropological models. If a story is being passed around orally, it is permutated at a much higher rate than if it's in a written source document, right? Documents tend to stabilize and compartmentalize a myth. Now, I'm not saying they still don't change. We see that, and Egypt's a perfect example. But you can at least go back
much
and look at
faster.
what was the original version, rather than accepting the version you have when it's first written down as the original version. And
people misremember, their memories fade, they forget certain things.
Well, they purposely change them is the most common. Now you can forget it.
Okay.
You change myths based upon your socio-political reality at the time. We see it, particularly, we talked about the cuneiform tablets in Anatolia. They are a blending of local Hittite belief with projections coming out of Sumerian Mesopotamia, because they want the gods to be represented with their localized names. So you change the names of the local heroes to match your own, but the mythical tradition is largely the same. It's an archetype, right? And it's just imported from somewhere else. And you change the names of the gods to make your gods more important and more powerful.
So according to the people who understood the myths at the time, how far back did they think that the actual creation event took place, where the gods took the clay and made humans? Was it dated, or was it just long ago in the distant past? You could never put it.
Okay. Oh, yeah, that's actually a really good
say
question.
How far back it was.
So in the Greek tradition, it's purposely nebulous. Remember, you have the age of gold, the age of silver, the age of bronze, the age of heroes, the age of iron, right? That's the current age when ancient Greeks are talking about. They live in the age of iron, which is the most devolved and base and evil, if you want to think about it, but the most degenerate form of mankind. So they talk about ancient races of mankind, various other versions of mankind, in kind of like in memoriam. Everything's based off the Trojan War in Greek mythology. If it happened before the Trojan War, it happened a really long fucking time ago.
Long-ass time
if
ago,
it happened after the Trojan War, even though it's semi-mythical, they kind of consider that real history rather than being nebulous, kind of you can't put a date on it history. So that's one of the things that Homer did, was kind of give Greeks a very delineated time. Now, they didn't know when the Trojan War occurred, but that was their dividing line. They didn't have a date for it, but that was the date. Everything after the Trojan War was important in context, and everything before the Trojan War was kind of like an extremely far and ancient myth. Didn't matter when the time was. So it occurred before the age of iron, right? So that's important as well. But if we're looking at the Genesis account, well, it's very important, because in Genesis, it seems like it's really important to try to date all these generations. This person lived for this long, this person lived for that long, this person lived for that long. So, I mean, whether or not it was the important point of the text, it does give you dates and does give you some rough estimate in time within that tradition. Now, there's been some people that have added all those dates up and said, well, this is exactly how old the Earth is. I don't think that, and I think very few scholars would say that was actually the point of saying that Noah lived to be 950 years old. It was just to say Noah lived a long fucking time ago, and he lived to be really, really old. And it kind of showed that a long life was to show that you had been pleasing and righteous in front of God. So Noah's given this awesome lifespan because he's a super awesome guy, at least in the way
super special.
Yeah, at least the way myself and I
super
think,
straight.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Thank you, Pat.
You can ask
go ahead,
Amy.
Is there some sort? Woohoo! Is there some sort of symbolism between clay or around clay? Because it seems just something, I guess, artistically we find it. I was just running it through my head. We find it in the ground, and it is what we make a lot of art, especially a lot of ancient art. Is there some sort of tie? And if not, why clay is my question.
So I'm just going to rattle off what a lot of people much smarter than me have been saying about this for a long time. So clay, one of the reasons that these are all, none of them are mutually exclusive from each other, right? Clay is ubiquitous in the ancient world as a building material. So clay makes a lot of sense, right? Sure. In Mesopotamia, you make clay bricks. The Greeks use clay for pottery and all kinds of other building materials.
Make anything out of it.
You make anything out of clay.
Almost anything. Yeah.
Clay was a base material, if you want to think of it that, as far as a building
Sure.
material in the ancient world. So it's common. Another reason it can be is because clay has no form of itself until it's shaped. It's void and not even able to be processed. You don't have clay until you've actually worked it into clay, at least within, to use it as a building material or to make pottery and all these things. Although you can use clay to make pretty rough pottery without doing any refinement to it. But given those caveats, clay requires someone to craft it. It's a crafted material, right? A pot doesn't spontaneously exist. A brick doesn't spontaneously come into being. So clay is something that requires an agent to act upon it, right? So that could be another explanation why clay. Could be that because in addition to being common, clay has no value really, right? Anybody can go out and take up clay and process it in the ancient world. That's the reason everybody used it. That's why we see people making their own clay objects and their own pots and other objects in ancient Greece, because anybody could go out and get clay, or most people could get clay and work it. So it was considered something of very low or no value in the ancient world. And that may have been a commentary on mankind's relationship to the gods, right? So there's all these different ways to interpret why clay may have been used. And I think it's actually all of them, depending on which lesson or moral you're trying to take from the story.
That makes a lot of sense.
In one way, clay is one of those extremely fine and delicate sculptural tools. The ancient Greeks, they sculpted in marble and stone and all kinds of stuff, but they also sculpted in terracotta or clay, and they made some very fine and highly detailed sculptures in antiquity. And this may have been seen as maybe an artistic, purity, like, clay being extremely great, to extremely fine features. Like, well, if you're going to sculpt this out of clay, you can make a fine copy and it can look like a human or whatever. So it may be that it was inherently good for use in artistic expression. And it's finite. Clay, if you drop a clay figurine, it's going to break. You drop a marble figurine, it's not going to break. So it may have been a commentary, like the gods are often created in large marble statues, although they were created in terracotta as well. But like, if mankind's clay, then he's not as permanent as if he would have been made as marble, right? He's finite. Again, these are all possible explanations, and they're all equally important and probable. And not any of them are mutually exclusive of any of the others.
Mm-hmm. And okay, that was my big question, James. If you didn't have another, we will switch into the Q&A, or ask yours and then we'll switch to the Q&A. Either one.
We can go to the Q&A. Anything that I'll add to the Q&A. So that.
All right. With that, it ends the presentation portion of Shaped from Clay.
I'm going to go ahead and end my sharing.
Sounds good. Well, you do that, and we are going to do. Woohoo!
We are back.
We are back. Welcome, everyone.
To the future.
To the future. Marty, did you go 88 miles an hour?
We kind of did just go back to the past, so yeah, it fits. Now we're back in 21st century. Looking for evidence of Moses. Nope. JEPD.
Are you telling me that there are multiple mythologies? There's not just like the one? But I thought there was.
I'm going to tell you, as someone like, I grew up, like, I think you guys have heard, like, my dad's Greek, right? So I grew up learning Greek mythology as kind of an aside to everything else. You're lucky to be Greek, right? But the truth is, like, studying mythology, you realize that the Greeks had a really varied tradition. Some Greek myths, like, Greeks lived throughout the Mediterranean. There were Greeks living along the coast of Turkey. There were Greeks living in Cyprus. There were Greeks living on Crete. There were Greeks living on Sicily and southern Italy. And these traditions weren't all the same. And they're they were similar in some cases. In some cases, they're really different. And when you say, "Oh, that's the Greek myth for this," and you only give one, you're as an academic, and even someone who wants to be at least credible, you're probably jumping down a big dark rabbit hole. I mean, it really is. It's like you're setting yourself up for failure if you say, "Yeah, this is the one single mythical account that was authoritative in the ancient world in either Greece, Rome, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and in some cases, looking at the J&P source, even in the Old Testament, in the Pentateuch, you had rival traditions coming together and being blended into one tradition in the case of the Pentateuch.
Yeah, even in the Bible, there are multiple stories of some of the same story.
Mm-hmm. Why is, just look at the 10 Commandments. Why are there 2 versions?
Well, I can answer that. That's because the 3rd tablet dropped.
Well, that is the Mel Brooks account.
Very near.
What did he?
He's 15.
Moses threw it.
10.
When he saw the people making the cow. But Amy, her heart would be broken if Moses wasn't just sitting there writing all this down as God spake to him. What's the book, Amy, of Moses writing it down?
Oh, dude, just spacking and spacking. No, keep on spacking. I've been here.
And the Lord spake unto Moses more. Speak unto the children of Israel, for I am Lord thy God, who brought thee out of the land of Egypt. Worship me.
Worship me, baby. And all right, we're going to move into questions. If you have questions for Pat, feel free to tag me in chat at Amy Newman. We have been having fun, and it opens with a fun one from John Vance.
Cool.
How can you explain human hybrid statues of half dog and half human?
So some ancient peoples didn't have a concept that gods had to be a singular entity. Egypt's a perfect example. Egypt hybridized human and, if you want to call it, animal form to help explain the nature of the gods. Horus is the falcon-headed god who, again, is extremely powerful, insightful, has dominion over air. Sun, it's in a later tradition, so this makes sense, right? That and the god in one case of Hathor has depictions not always with human features. She can be sometimes seen as a mystic cow. The god Sekhmet, she's a ferocious, vengeful goddess at times. She's got the head of a lion. This is more of a device to explain why the gods look they do when they do. But there are other gods that are completely human. There was an Egyptian god known as Seker, right? Seker was just a human, just running around. Osiris, just a human, right? Isis, just a human, or had human form.
Yeah.
Right. So it also, there were gods that were uniquely hybridized to explain their roles and their divine nature. And sometimes they could change between human and hybridized human animal form at will. And these are all very common elements in certain mythical tradition. And Greeks had certain aspects, like, Zeus could change shape. Certain gods could appear at times as in disguise, so to speak. This wasn't that uncommon.
Now, Amy's been wondering why in the Christian tradition, when you had godlike figures interbreeding with humans, they became giants. But that didn't happen in other cultures. When that happened?
Well,
were they?
So I'm not going to comment too much on this, but the giants may have just been a reference to great and powerful people.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we might be filling in.
This is a question for some. I can answer the question, but I'm not going to. I'm going to save it for someone else who can give it a much more thorough examination off the top of their head. I don't have all the source material for it cited in my brain.
That's okay, because we have another question.
Sure.
We got more.
How much do you think the divergence in accepted myths had to do with problems and limitations in communication, literacy rates, and just problems communicating over distances?
I think that's an important. Whoever that was, great question.
That was
very
me.
insightful. Okay, very insightful. So that is a problem, particularly regionality, right? So just interpretive. If I tell you I worship, and I'm just going to make up names so it'll be more illustrative. I worship Bozo, the god of clowns, and you worship a god of humor, and his name is haha. They're not synonymous. Like what haha means in my society is slightly different than what bozo means in your society. But how do you explain who these two gods are, particularly when you're trying to cross a linguistic barrier? So often that's one conflation that can occur. But we both may have a god of the air, and we have a god that, let's just say that you have a tradition and his name is Skyus, and he's a god that lives on a cloud, and his job is to make rain. And I have a god named Windus, and my god who lives in the sky lives on a cloud. But what he does is he doesn't make it rain. He makes the wind blow, and he makes the sun come up. Wait a minute. Are they the same god? Well, we're trying to explain who our gods are to each other. Yeah. I move into your territory. I bring my traditions with me. The next thing we know is we'll see a blending of those two traditions. In some cases, we have Skyus, the sky god, who does all of it, and he's just regionalized into a larger pantheonic system. Or in some cases, we have him, commemorated in one region one way and another region another way, because people settled in a different place and blended local traditions and customs together. And I hope that kind of answers the question. But
no,
it's actually
makes
extremely complex.
Also, because you said it twice, I now have to go make it rain.
Make it rain.
Okay.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, because they're mythic creatures, they're mythic figures. So you can't actually go find the god and see what he looks like and what he does. So he can just be whatever people think he is at the time. They can shape and mold him whatever they want.
One of the most illustrative examples when you're first, starting off in grad school, and I think even some undergrads get this now, particularly people that study mythical literature, right? So if you're a classicist, this is something you'll get pretty early on. So if you study the Etruscans, the Romans, and the Greeks, there's always this trope. The Etruscans, Greeks, and Romans all had the same mythologies. They didn't. Just look at their depiction of how they each depicted their prime deity. We'll say Zeus, Jupiter, and I'm going to use them together because it's a male and female pair, Tin and Uni, right? Zeus and his wife, he's a cad. He is an a-hole, right? Zeus treats his wife awful, right? Jupiter is a more serious version he's not identical to Zeus. In a Roman context, he's a much more serious god, associated with the conservative nature of the state. His philandering, yes, it happens in the Roman mythical tradition, but it's not as aggrandized. He's a much more serious god. And the Etruscan mythology is all about fidelity.
Serious philandering.
Yeah. Tin is loyal to his wife Uni to a fault. But you can't say so. Tin is Uni, is Jupiter, is Zeus, because those traditions are vastly different. But you read a book on mythology, an introductory book, often will just say, yeah, they'll call Jupiter Roman Zeus. That really does a disservice to.
There might have been similarities.
There's similarities, and sometimes there are a lot of similarities, but there are also enough uniqueness that we can see in certain traditions that
not copy and pasted.
It's not copy and pasted, and even if it's copied and pasted, there is some word editing after the copy and paste to make it your own.
And all right, moving along from X Music or XI Music. Do you have an opinion on the Hebrews coming out and being an offshoot of the Canaanite population and religion?
Yes. Yes. The Hebrews are a group that either moved in and assimilated with or originated out of the ancient Canaanites. And because they were groups that were blending, it's hard to say it's all one or all the other. But yes, the ancient Hebrews are related to the ancient Canaanites, both in custom, belief, and practice.
Another question from XI Music. JSource, ? Documentary. Hypothesis is your view?
Yes.
The Yahwist.
Question from Mark, who just did a fantastic debate last night, which everybody should go check out. Send in love, Mark. He asked, Greek mythology has a Pygmalion, 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 who sculpted a statue that came to life. Does this tie in with creation myths at all, or are they completely separate?
No, but it's again, I would say it's all interrelated. Like, is it possible to create life? I mean, again, a single point of creation or multiple point of creation. Is this a progenitor myth, right? Progenitor myth being who, like, I always ask, when you're talking about ancient Greek cities, one of three people are responsible. Usually it's one of two most of the time, but it's Hercules or Theseus. Who's the guy who founded your city by having sex with an ancient queen or the daughter of a king, princess, right? Who gave rise to a new offshoot of men, or a population of men who sometimes go out and grab other women or sometimes marry with the local women around them. But these are foundation myths. These are how in each, not all, but most or many cities in the ancient Mediterranean that were Greek colonies, and in many cases Roman colonies, had a progeneration myth, a foundation myth. Like, yeah, Hercules sailed here with his crew, stopped off, had met the king of the region. His name was Baucis. Baucis had a daughter named Pridius, and they had Hercules had sex with her before moving on in his journey. She had a son who later became king, and so we're all related to Hercules, and they have a mythical foundation for their city. So, yeah, it's all related.
Moving right along, a pseudonym asks, does archaeology holistically end 6,000 years ago?
No. See this. So archaeology. When does paleontology start, and when does Neolithic studies start, and archaeology end? It's a complex question. Archaeology relies on discovery and interpretation of material evidence. Now, can I go look at a Neolithic site as an archaeologist? Yes. But if you don't have anything to interpret, then it becomes extremely problematic. Archaeology is an evidentiary-based discipline. Not always. It's somewhat interpretive at times, but you try to gather evidence in order to make observations and reflections. At a certain point, we just don't have a lot of physical evidence, and there is some debate whether or not when archaeology ends, when Neolithic studies begins, are Neolithicists actually archaeologists? When are paleontologists? When are they actually acting as archaeologists? This is all cross-disciplinary, but roughly, archaeology limits itself to around 5,000, 4,000 BCE. But it's not necessarily a hard and fast rule.
Not so much Indiana Jones, huh?
No, but I mean, you do have people that study Neolithic culture who call them, especially late Neolithicists, who call themselves archaeologists, and it's not problematic because you get known for the period you study. And there are archaeologists who start off studying one period and end up studying another, and they don't change their degree title.
Archaeology.
So we have 3 or 4 questions left. So if you would like to ask Pat a question on the mythical origins of humankind.
I do want to add one thing. So like if you were to ask Pat my degree for my MA, my archaeology degree is in classical and Mediterranean studies. So like even my degree says I'm an archaeologist who studies this period. So basically my 8th century BCE through 5th, 6th century CE. Because if you try to study it all, your brain will explode. So you need to limit it both by locality and time period. Otherwise, there's just too much to learn.
And I find that is the benefit of being an expert, is that you get really awesome, really knowledgeable in a single subject. And so when people need to reference you, they know they're getting someone who's really put, their passion and their time and energy to actually study the material.
But it is nice you get to expand a little bit, but real experts like Pat here always make sure that when they delve outside of that area that they do say, I'm not an expert on this, but I have studied it a little bit, so I can give an opinion, but you might want to
Well,
check another source, maybe.
and that is the other notion. You'll find this. I've seen this from Pat. I've seen this from Josh. When it, just like James says, whenever an actual expert, whenever they go out of their expertise, they are very quickly to go, whoa, 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 whoa. And it's like almost like they have the imaginary line, and once that line, they're like, send that person back.
Yeah.
But that, once again, that's the great thing about having experts.
So I'm gonna make it. This is how graduate school was explained to me. You read one book on a subject, you've gained some familiarity. You read 20 books on the same subject, but from different people and different ideas, you may start developing an understanding of the topic. You read 50 books on a topic, you may start developing some subject matter expertise, and that's the difference. And that's why, like, I've read a couple books on cuneiform culture and mythical traditions coming out of Mesopotamia. That's why I don't try to assert that I'm an expert other than in generalities on them, right? Especially when you start talking about various copies of the Eruditogenesis and differences between those. That's beyond anything I would ever study, because I don't need to. Other people much smarter than me have done the analysis. And so as long as I'm acquainted with their work, I can reference it. That's how scholarship works.
You don't want to be caught pretending to be an expert on something you're not. Say something wrong.
And all right, moving along. Question from Mark. Woo-hoo. Do you think the story of Zeus creating men of the Golden Age, Silver Age, and Bronze Age pair up to anything in the biblical account or other cultures?
Well, yes, but maybe not in the way that I'll answer the question trying to think. I'm going to channel what I think is Mark's thought on this. So fallen races, fallen people is a theme that's very common, that there was in many mythical traditions, not all, there's a race that is a servitor race to the gods. In Mesopotamia, it's the lesser gods, right? In Greek mythology, the race of gold were extremely noble, and without angering the gods, they existed in harmony with the gods. They were able to do things that then men of iron, talking about the race of gold, could only imagine, right? These are people that walked near the gods. They weren't gods themselves, but existed in near proximity to, right? When they died and became asleep, they became these agents for the gods. Their spirits became what we know as daemons, right? They're going to be later called demons. But these are people that were divine agents in Greek mythology, and so
their version of demons.
I mean, you could also be equated. They were also angels, right? They were agents of good and evil, depending on the purpose they were sent. And in many cases, they're only good, but then later corrupted and evil. But they're Greek myths, have different versions of how they'd come into existence. But the important thing to remember is, these older races are like, oh man, back in the day, things were so great, and these people were so awesome, and the gods loved them so much. They were like near gods themselves, or godlike, or granted with extremely important lives. And in some ways that, again, since we're talking about the Bible, and that seems to be the focus of what you guys are doing currently in your Bible study class, you could argue that in the Pentateuch, the patriarchs are these men that are greater than life as agents of God, right? No one's going to be as good as Noah. No one's going to be as good as Moses. No one's going to be as good as Abraham, right? Abraham are always the models for greater people. And we and again, like in Greek mythology, they always use the people of the Trojan War as the models of true and just and good behavior. Even though he's a fatal character, Hector is noble and he dies, but he's like the greatest of the Trojans, and he's an honorable man and a great leader and great war leader and all these things. So it's just,
I was just gonna say, but the thing I noticed in the Bible what it constantly does is it takes these figures like Noah, Abraham, and it kind of breaks them down. Like they fail God in some way, but then God usually finds a way to bring them back to status. Like with Lot and with his daughters, and then Abraham found him naked in the tent, drunk as a skunk, and then they do that. Moses with the whole thing with Aaron and the golden calf. They had these people, they failed God, but He's able to bring them back, and everything's okay.
Some people more than others, right? Like Abraham, I would actually say that, Abraham served God unerringly, right? That's why he's Father Abraham. Moses did a really good job. He had a couple little stumbles, but ultimately he's Lot's whole account is one, always questioning God's will, right? Like, why do you got to destroy the city? What if I find 5 people? What if I find 2 people? That account is about what ultimately happens to Lot's downfall. Is Lot is questioning God. So Lot's a cautionary tale, right? Noah's nakedness has been interpreted by people a lot of ways. I don't want to go into it, but Noah's drunkenness may have been something that doesn't really have to do with his nakedness in the way you're thinking, and the son just saw him naked. It may have been allusions to like some inner, like some Oedipus issues. That's all I'm going to say, and that's a commentary other people can make, not myself. And I'm not saying they don't have to be parallel, right? Like the Greek tradition can be different than the Hebrew or Jewish tradition. Mesopotamian tradition can be different, but they may have some common themes. Like in Zoroastrianism, right? We know that there's an angelology, right? There's angels. Well, that some ways sounds like in some ways they're not going to be identical. We don't expect them to be identical.
No.
And where there's similarities, we compare and contrast them, and we note the differences. And we don't want cultures to be carbon copies of each other, so to speak. We want them to be unique, so that lets us learn about them and actually understand the ancient people of this region compared to ancient people of other regions, right?
Woo-hoo. And I think it goes along with this question. I'm not sure. Is there evidence of instances where people rejected all explanations offered by these myths and adopted an I don't know stance or some other fringe position?
So the development of atheism, let's just call it what it is a really complex question. There are some thoughts that within the Hellenistic and Greek, well, Greek being Hellenistic, they're synonymous terms, tradition, that there was a philosophical development of a detached God or detached gods, nature of gods, right? Gods don't care. If you study Epicurus on Epicureanism, like the gods may not really be interested in the humans, and so they're non-acting agents, right? So it doesn't really matter if they exist or not because they're not helping us. If you ain't working for me, you ain't worthy of my worship, right? So there were some Greeks who thought the gods were detached from the act, so they would be like deists, right? In a modern context, they're not doing anything for me. They fell asleep a long time ago, and the world's going on the way it is. But those were minor views. That was really, really rare, and it wasn't divine. It wasn't developed in antiquity the way that we have modern atheism, right? There was this kind of reserved concept. I mean, there were some people who talked out against the gods, like, well, why are we doing this? Why are we doing that? But impiety, actual denying the gods and acting against their agency in antiquity, particularly ancient Greece is the area of study, was a good way to get yourself executed and or thrown out, exiled. So the common convention was, you did what you needed to do. You just didn't think the gods were acting as agents in your life. So you became an agnostic. And that would probably be a better way to reflect how some ancient Greeks, and I'm only going to comment about ancient Greeks because that's the people and culture I study in the ancient Thracians. Ancient Thracians don't have a tradition of doubting their gods. They seem to be extremely pious people in that concept, right? They had a really developed sense of ancestral worship that was very important to them culturally, particularly how the Greeks portrayed it. They're like, wow, these people really pay attention to who their ancestors were so they can properly venerate them. If you go to modern Bulgaria today, you drive around, you see all these burial mounds from the period that I study. Like every, I mean, there's places that are actually known as the Valley of the Kings, and it's not in Egypt, it's in Thrace, where there's just so many burial mounds. There's literally hundreds because they buried all these kings of various epics of Thracian history, and they were these burial mounds actually act as kind of mini temples because there was cultic activity going on there to venerate the dead king, because the dead kings became like divine heroes in Thracian mythology and Thracian religion.
They were worshipped after death.
Right. Mm-hmm. So
because I was just going to say, I haven't read probably anywhere near the amount you've read, but it seems like I have noticed a few times in reading, particularly Roman, where it not your man on the street, but your more upper echelon. There seemed to be a lot of like they didn't really believe in the gods. They of course they did everything they had to do outright, but they really didn't believe that it was real. But it was kind of just something to string the public along, more so.
I mean, that's how some of the really intelligent aristocracy and intellectuals in Greece approached religion. They kind of said, well, the rubes need it, but they all did it, right? And they were like, again, the majority of ancient peoples were highly religious. It would be really hard to distinguish an ancient Greek and many early Christians as far as the level of religiosity in their daily life. And when you actually reconstruct, like for example at Pompeii, again, that's a hybridized society. They're Romans, but the city was Greek ethnically, and there were a lot of Greeks there with some additional Latin additive elements, right? Pompeii is a really good example. We can reconstruct the life of a lot of people at Pompeii, and the people at Pompeii were extremely, like, you woke up in the morning and you made offerings, like in your home. You prayed to the gods that you'd have a good day. Your wife, after you left, offered the home protective spirits, the lares and penates and these other protective spirits in your home. They offered them sacrifices and prayers to make sure that not only the house was protected, but you were protected as you walked around town, right? So these were pretty religious people. They believed the gods did things for them and that the gods were worthy of respect and adoration.
So I'm sure most of them did. I've just, but there were some element of disbelief, but that was probably kept pretty private.
Well, but I would say that although we have some writings and those are really shown, look, this guy didn't believe in the gods at all, or he doubted the existence of the gods. For every one of those, we literally have thousands of other sources
overwhelming majority of them
declare the gods to be acting agents in the ancient world, and that's like a perfect example is Marcus Aurelius is considered this great philosopher, right? He was an all right philosopher, to be honest with you. He wasn't anything special of the period he was in, but his work survived, right? But Marcus Aurelius was highly religious. So if he was one of the great thinkers of his age, he was highly religious. He founded a lot of Celtic worship groups, and he put a lot of money behind it, and he appears to have been extremely observant of certain religious practices. And if he was really to lack of a better term, a doubting Thomas, in this case, a doubting Aurelius, he would have changed religious function within the Roman state, but obviously he thought it was an important enough social institution, and appears by his own writings to have been a dedicated devotee of his
true believer,
right? That he acted accordingly.
And all right, moving right along. Question from John Venice: our modern buildings won't even last a century. You think a clay building can withstand desert conditions for thousands of years?
Clay? No, that's the problem with Dr. Josh is better to talk to about it. I mean, I study archaeology, so I do study clay buildings. That's why we love the Greeks and the Romans, right? Because they built stuff out of stone, and it's lasted. Egypt built stuff out of stone. It's where we have. So brick can be made a couple ways, and we're talking about terracotta or mud brick, right? So you can just take a mud brick, and uncure it, no curing at all, make a mud hut. Well, that doesn't last at all. You can sun bake a brick. You can sun dry it. That's pretty good, but even that will quickly weather. But you can heat fire a brick, right? Like we do modern bricks today. And that'll last quite a while. I mean, just think of how long a modern brick home will last. So again, that's the problem. In Mesopotamia, they used a lot of sun-dried bricks versus kiln-fired bricks, which became the Roman standard. That's why you have a lot of Roman brick buildings that survive to this day, because they heat-fired their bricks rather than sun-dried their bricks in many instances. Like particularly the roof tiles, right? That's why when you go to a Roman archaeological site, you have all these, some roughly 18-inch by 18-inch. They vary in size, but, lack of argument. They got the big, nice, flat tiles because they made the roofs out of tile. Tile roofs, nothing new. Greeks did it. Romans did it. It's not nothing new in the ancient world.
Question from Farron Salas. When did the jinn concept get incorporated into clay coming to life?
So you're talking about Islam, and the concept of jinn is a if you want to actually identify the region, it's ancient Saudi Arabia today. That was very unique. It was very ubiquitous concept. I shouldn't say unique, but it was a concept. The jinn, or spirits, good and bad, right, was a very common aspect within pre-Islamic paganism, and that,
Islam just adopted it.
It was again very much like the Greeks took the Greek daemons, right? Christianity modified it into demon, but it was an earlier pagan concept that was culturally ubiquitous, and so was adopted into a new tradition, a new faith system. But I'm not a specialist in that area, and that's just and I'm confident of what I've just said, but beyond that, I would be speculating without doing additional research.
Mm-hmm. The new last 3 questions. So if you got questions for Pat, send them in. This is your chance. We are talking Shaped from Clay, the mythical origins of humankind. We're here with Pat Lowinger. Heat Shield says, brief catch up, ? Hi, we're with Mr. A, who is this, and Mr. B, who does this. There you go. There you go. There was the summary, baby. We're all caught up and sending love to Heat Shield. From Aunt Jur, who I believe was scooping up. She was helping a question from someone else, but I'm not 100% sure. Why does the title of the stream say the mythical origins of humankind when Pat was only talking about Greek culture, not all of humanity?
Well, I was taking certain traditions, right? So, I mean, like I said, many cultures have some type of, if you want to call it, human genesis, right? The creation of mankind. And I'm just referring to the ones that I'm familiar with and that have been the focus of my study, and particularly the Mediterranean and adjacent area of Mesopotamia, because I'm looking at the projection of certain mythical traditions from Mesopotamia through Anatolia, sometimes through the Levant, into ancient Greece. And I also look at it the other way, by the way. There were, if you wanted, to lack of a better term, there are Celtic traditions adopted by the Greeks as well. But that's problem with the Celts is they weren't a literate society, so sometimes we don't have a full, robust knowledge of their mythical tradition outside some limited amount of material culture, which is highly interpretive.
Woohoo! Moving right along.
What he's an expert on, what he knows about.
Only covering what he's an expert on.
I'm not an expert. I'm at this point I consider myself
a scholar.
Well versed, but not. I don't know if I'm
well read.
I'm well read. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And all right, I think this is the last question for tonight, and then we will let Pat. If he didn't cover, I want to have one more time. He could show what he's all about. Archaeology, baby. And then where you can find him. So with that, I know it would be outside.
Killing Nazis.
It's always with the face burning off. That's how all Nazis die. Their skin just yes, exactly. I know it would be outside his expertise, but does he have any info on smaller sects and little known cults having separate myths of their own?
Yes. And we see a lot of individual mythical development with inside mystery religions, which is exactly one of my areas of focus in my research. So how were mystery religions and those cultic activities projected throughout the Mediterranean is one of the things I'm looking at with some detail. So the problem with some mystery religions is we don't have any information on them outside archaeological evidence. There's not a written account. Sometimes we have some partial literary evidences. A lot of times they're maintained inside like depictions, like they're painted on the side of a wall, or they were noted in a tablet or stela, or even maybe on the side of a pot. So we're interpreting what these religious beliefs were. But we do sometimes see just the protection of certain cultic beliefs through regionally. Like, for example, the Temple of Isis at Pompeii was an obvious site for associated mystery religion or cultic activity associated with the mystery religion of Isis at Pompeii. That's just one good example. And again, my cuckoo clock that my wife had to have when we went to Germany.
That's epic.
Yeah, and there's no way to turn it off. I turned it down as low as it go.
Yeah, German engineering. Yeah. Are you familiar with Mithraism? Did they have a creation story or what they adopted?
Right, and the whole myth. Again, there's a problem with just saying, worship of Mithras, right? Yes, it's an import into the Roman. I studied the Roman version, but there was a pre-Roman cultic activity in the East, in Persia, and even maybe a little bit east of Persia, because we don't know exactly where Mithraism originates. Like, what is its its loci? Where does it actually, the point of it originates from? But we do know is that during the 2nd and 3rd century AD or CE, it gets brought in with some zealous, there's a lot of people who like it, into the Roman world. It gets brought into the Roman Empire. And there's been some arguments, and it's pretty well developed scholarship regarding, was the version and variety of Mithraism that we see adopted in the Roman Empire, was it line for line, text for text, precept upon precepts, the religion that we had been observed in Persia? Probably not. It was heavily Romanized. And in the Roman context, the worship of Mithras as a god was associated almost uniquely with the military, and always with men. Women were excluded, and non-Romans, particularly Romans who had never served in the military, weren't often included. So again, it had a unique social role, and it was a mystery religion. The cult didn't talk about its strictures, its ranks. We know what the ranks were only because the various temples, or Mithraeum Mithraea being singular, they were nice enough in some cases to leave actual depictions of various ranks and strictures and what their titles were within the artwork and iconography of the temples themselves. And interestingly enough,
Andrew is asking if Mithra was a sun god.
Yes, and he was often in the Roman context associated with and sometimes conflated, and I don't mean conflated as equals, but sometimes the imagery is mixed between him and the god Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. So again, this is important within the study, and we see a lot of we see Mithraea, particularly along the Roman limes, you guys call it the Roman walls, right? But the Roman fortifications starting at Hadrian's Wall, running down the Rhine all the way to the Danube. We see a lot of Mithraea in these regions, although there were Mithraea in Rome and other places as well. But these temples, popped up, were very popular for a couple centuries, and then, after Christianity gets in vogue, Mithraea go into decline, and ultimately the worship of Mithras is outlawed, for lack of a better term, within the Roman world. But by the time it was outlawed, it was had already declined down to being extremely marginalized as a religion, even when associated with the Roman military. But interestingly enough, Roman Mithraea looked very much like early basilicas, which were the foundational buildings of churches. So again, there is some possibility. There was some, one day you're a member of the cult of Mithras, but then you adopt Christianity, but you don't jettison all your beliefs.
Right.
Right. So
what do you think was it about Mithraism that helped it to spread all the way from Persia, Babylon, all the way to Rome? What do you think aspect of it made it?
The Roman military. It was highly fraternal. And whether or not this is a correct interpretation, there are some interpretations that within Mithraic society, or the societies and the cultic unit, the people associated with the cult, right? The communities that were part of it, the men, right? And there is some possibilities that like male slaves could be admitted to the cult if they had a sponsor, right? But there is possibility there was some social equality which was absent outside the cult. So like you're in the Roman military and you're a soldier, you're just a soldier. You keep your mouth fucking shut and you don't say anything, right?
You have a rank and that's it.
Right, but and you could be in the same Mithraeum as a general. Now, I don't necessarily think that's actually how it worked. I think generals still were prestigious within the Mithraea, because typically we look at the dedications, right? The people with money were still bigwigs. within these Mithraic, but this did seem to be a place that outside military, the rigidity of the Roman military system, there was a certain amount of informality that was allowed. So imagine a bunch of military guys having a common VFW. And I know that's not the best analogy, but it's a place where they could all go have a beer together. And even though there was social distinction between them, it allowed some social blending that wouldn't have been available outside of this culture.
Fraternization and stuff that would have been frowned upon.
It was very
elsewhere
fraternal.
could take place.
And not every Roman soldier joined. You had to be recruited, for lack of a better term. You had to have a sponsor, and you didn't just show up with $50 and say, "Hey, I want to join the Mithraean."
Thank you, Pat.
And all right, that is going to conclude our Q&A section of Talk Skeptic to Me. Thus, I am going to hand it over to Pat so he can tell us our final thoughts on the subject and where our viewers can find more if they'd like to learn.
Or Pat Lowinger.
Do 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 do. Mana mana. Boo boo doo boo. Woohoo!
Well, thanks for having me, and everybody in the chat. Thank you. You were all very kind. I do get asked, like, do I offer classes? I do offer classes in a couple different ways. So ultimately, what I, as an instructor teaching ancient history and archaeology, try to let people know is that we live in a much more culturally blended world today, and we can see that the ancient people of particularly the ancient Mediterranean and Western Black Sea did as well. Cultural blending is the norm, and understanding how ancient cultures lived and understanding as much as we can about those ancient cultures is a really good way to reflect upon our modern condition, for lack of a better term. If you'd like to take classes with me, I do teach at Tacoma Community College in Tacoma, Washington. I teach both traditional, but what I would point most of you to is online continuing education classes that I design that are in the fields of anthropology and history. And those are typically shorter classes, anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks, meeting anywhere from 90 minutes to 2 hours, with limited reading, mostly instructor-initiated stuff. In the fall, for example, we're doing kind of a 8-week analysis. Again, people smarter than me, we're looking at Owen Davies' recent Oxford Illustrated History of Witchcraft and Magic, and it's kind of a summary of history of Western European magic and what happens within those traditions and how they're later villainized from their earlier origins. So that'll be something, if you wanted to join, we're doing that both online and in person. Hopefully, it's definitely happening in person, and whether or not there's an online component is still to be determined by the institution. But I also myself offer classes online. If you go to my blog, it's discoveringancienthistory.wordpress.com. You'll see that you can, what I believe to be a nominal fee, myself and some other people that I work with, both in Romania and outside of Romania, are offering a series of classes. Some of them expert in areas differently than my own. And so we offer those classes as well. So both through the institution and outside the institution, I do offer classes to students. But all of my classes I offer through Discovering Ancient History are all online. We use Zoom and we use Google Classroom, and it's very similar to what you would do as an online experience in a college. The next class I'm teaching there, by the way, starting September 8th, is The New Testament You Ever Knew. It's like an introduction to New Testament studies and textual criticism from an historical and anthropological perspective. That's it. And I want to say thanks for having me. And if I made a mistake tonight,
so much,
I don't know everything. So it's possible you should go out and fact check me. And if you find that I made some error, like Pat, actually this scholar who you said this and someone else said that, send it to me in email. I will take a look at it and I will respond to your email. And I may say something like, yeah, I've looked at that and I don't agree with it. So I presented my opinion, but I could have made a better argument by presenting even opinions contrary to my own. And that's what a good presenter and a good instructor does, is although I think things are certain ways, it's important for me to present views that are outside my own within academic circles. So that's it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Pat.
Thank you so very much.
That was a great,
Pat.
great episode. I think everybody
It
learned a lot.
was. I hope you all had a fun time on this episode of Talk Skeptic to Me, shaped from clay, the mythical origins of humankind. I want to
If that
thank our
triggers you,
special.
oh well.
Yeah. I want to thank our special guest host, Pat Lowinger, and my co-host, James W. All three of us are joining the Discord after the show, so feel free to join our little skeptic and ranting community. If you're feeling fancy, don't forget to like, follow, or subscribe. Then switch that bell icon to all so you can be part of our live streams. Finally, if you'd like to help us make even more fun content, feel free to check out our Patreon at patreon.com/Amy Newman. I'm Amy Newman. We'll see you on Discord, and I will also see you on the next episode of Skeptic Ball Z. Good night, everyone.
Good night, guys.
It was fun. Had a blast.